Hi, class. We are still on neurology, and the next section that we're going to be talking about is the neuroglial cells. I have uh, some videos that talk about the neuron. We talk about the structural classification, the functional classification. Remember, structurally, it was unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar. And functionally, there was sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. We spoke about the different parts of the neuron, the dendrites, the cell body, the axon hillock, Schwann cells, node of Ranvier, axon terminal, synaptic end bulb, um, Nissl bodies, nucleus, soma, aka cell body, and dendrites. So those were some of the key terms and things to review to refamiliarize yourselves with. Now that we've done the neuron, let's look at its helper cells called the neuroglial cells, either neuroglial or neuroglial, which means nerve glue. What we're looking at in the middle, that's a neuron, and everything else around it that you see, those are neuroglial cells. They make up half the volume of the central nervous system. Okay, they're 50 times more numerous than neurons. They can divide and multiply rapidly. They're involved in different tumors called gliomas. And in terms of neuroglial cells, there are four in the central neural system and two in the peripheral neural system. So we have six altogether. The four in the CNS are astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, microglia, and ependymol. I'll go over all four of them and their primary functions. Schwann cell is in the peripheral neural system, and satellite cells. Of the six, satellite cell, not that it's not important, it's really just a supporting cell. We'll focus on the functions of the other five primarily. So here is a picture that's illustrating. Look way down at the bottom. If we look down at the bottom and we look way up at top and everything in between, you'll see a bunch of the terms that I had mentioned. So ependymal cells I mentioned, microglial cell, astrocyte, oligodendrocyte. Those are a few neuroglial cells. Here's another oligodendrocyte. Here's another astrocyte. Um, in the center, in the yellow, we are already familiar with neurons. We already know the neurons. So the supporting cells are all around it. So let's look at what some of their functions are. The astrocyte, astronomer, astrology, astronaut, right? They all go to outer space, stars. So astro means star, and it's named by its shape. What the astrocyte is, if you look, here's the process of a neuron. Here's a blood vessel. It's the bridge between the two. It's connecting the two. So we call it the BBB, which means it forms the blood-brain barrier. It forms the blood-brain barrier by covering the blood capillaries and connecting to the neurons. They're designed to metabolize neurotransmitters, and they're regulating potassium balance. Remember, if this is a cell, cells have lots of potassium on the inside, and they have lots of sodium on the outside. And what you learned about in AMP1 was the concentration gradient, where wherever you have more of something, it always moves in the direction of where there's more to where there's less. So sodium always wants to move intracellularly, and then potassium gets kicked out. It goes this way. Sodium rushes in, potassium rushes out. That's how electrical currents are created, and that's what also helps maintain the membrane potential, or what's called the resting membrane potential, which you will learn is negative 70 millivolts. Okay, the oligodendrocyte. Now, this is analogous to the Schwann cell. Now, I mentioned Schwann cell in a previous video because the Schwann cells myelinate. They produce that myelin sheath, that fatty insulation that's made up of cholesterols. It wraps it around the axon. Oligodendrocytes do the exact same thing as Schwann cells. The difference here is real estate. Real estate is all about location, location, location. So the oligodendrocyte is located in the peripheral. Sorry, the oligodendrocyte is located in the central neural system, whereas the Schwann cell is located in the peripheral neural system. Functionally, they do the same thing. So oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells both produce myelin. It's just where they myelinate. Oligodendrocytes myelinate the brain and the spinal cord, and the Schwann cells myelinate everything else, all the other neurons outside of the brain and outside of the spinal cord. So here's a myelination. They're produced by Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes. So the yellow is the axon, and think of the Schwann cell as like a macrophage. You know how macrophages engulf things and they eat them and break them down? Well, it looks like it's eating the axon. It's taking it in, right? It's engulfing it. And what it does doesn't break it down, but it keeps wrapping around and around and around. And it keeps wrapping around like a jelly ring and creates this myelin sheath, this protection around the axon. Now, there's autoimmune diseases in which the body can attack the myelin sheath, or it attacks the Schwann cells, or it attacks the oligodendrocytes. And when there's an autoimmune disease, an autoimmune disease in which the body is breaking down the myelin sheath or destroying Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes, that means if you can't produce myelin, the nerve conduction slows down. The nerves don't fire and the body doesn't quite work the way it should. And that disease is what we call MS, multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease where the body attacks its myelin sheath or attacks the Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes. Typically, the first symptom that shows up with MS, it usually affects the smallest muscles and the smallest nerves, which happens to be in the eye. So it tends to attack the myelin of the optic nerve, which is cranial nerve number 2. So people will get visual disturbances with MS first. Okay, just weird symptoms with their eyes. Most autoimmune diseases tend to attack women versus men. Men have more cardiovascular issues, women have more autoimmune issues, and that's because women have the stronger immune system. So if you have a stronger immune system, think of a strong immune system like a strong pit bull. Every now and then, the pit bull can turn against its rightful owner, just like a strong immune system can attack its rightful owner. Microglial cells. Microglial cells, in the previous slide when I talked about Schwann cells, I said think of it as a macrophage, like cell eating or engulfing something to destroy it, except the oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells aren't destroying anything, they're myelinated. Microglial cells, on the other hand, these come from monocytes. A monocyte is a white blood cell. And monocytes are always in your bloodstream. They're floating around in your bloodstream, in your blood vessels, okay? And when they're floating around in your blood vessels, if there happens to be damage in a tissue, like a muscle or an organ or a kidney or a liver or a brain, the monocyte goes into the tissue it leaves the blood vessels or the bloodstream, goes into the tissue, and now it's called a macrophage. And if the macrophage is in the brain, it's a microglial cell. If the macrophage is in the lung, it's called an alveolar dust cell. If the macrophage is in the liver, if it's in the liver, they're called Kupffer cells. Kupffer cells. And if they are in the blood because they're trying to wall off damaged LDL cholesterol, let's say it's damaged, it's bad, and it walls it off, that's called a foam cell. So monocytes become macrophages, and they just change their name depending on what tissue they're in. When it's in the neural system, they're called microglial cells, and all they're doing is clearing away pathogens, microbes, or different types of cellular debris and even dead cells. So they're phagocytic. They're phagocytic. They clear away dead debris, dead cells and dead debris. Ependymal cells. The ependymal cells are associated with cerebral spinal fluid. They line these chambers that are called, or cavities in the brain that are called ventricles. Much like in the heart, where you have atria and ventricles, in the brain, you have lateral ventricles, which are 1 and 2. Then you have a third ventricle and a fourth ventricle. So you have 4 ventricles, 4 chambers that are involved in circulating and producing cerebral spinal fluid. It's the ependymal cells that actually produce them. There are 2 lateral ventricles because when we look at the brain, we know there's a left and right hemisphere. One ventricle is on this side of the brain, the other is here. Whereas the third and fourth are midline structures. But lateral ventricles are lateral to that center line. So there's 2 of them, lateral ventricle 1 and 2. Satellite cells, I said, not too important in terms of functionally. They're just supporting cells. They just support neurons in the PNS, where we have ganglia. Remember, you had the dorsal root ganglia that looks like the lollipop stick, the dorsal root ganglia. So satellite cells support those. Schwann cells we already covered when we did oligodendrocytes. They produce the myelin sheath in the peripheral neural system. So the axon's in the middle, and then the thick substance going around, that's the myelin. When it breaks down in that autoimmune condition, that's multiple sclerosis. Now, what I went over earlier when I drew in a previous video the cross section of the spinal cord, we said the butterfly, or the letter H in the middle, is gray matter. And we said all the stuff surrounding it is myelinated, so it appears white. That's white matter. Okay, and then this is where your dorsal roots are. And then this way, that would be your ventral nerve roots. Right? Sensory information comes in, and then motor information comes out. These are the horns. This is your dorsal horn. These are your ventral horns. Dorsal horn, ventral horn. So all the sensory information comes in and synapses on the dorsal horn. Then you have that interneuron. That's the relay man that connects the sensory info to the ventral horn where the motor output goes. And right here in the center, right there, there's a little hole, and that's called the central canal, and cerebral spinal fluid flows through there to help bathe and cushion the spinal cord. Back here, these are the posterior columns for all your proprioceptive awareness. And a lot of your tracts, your sensory and motor tracts, are located in the white matter. And you will learn about the sensory and motor tracts in your textbook, but they name them by the direction that the signals are traveling. I'll give you an example. A tract, think of the tracts as elevators that go up or down the spinal cord. And if they go up, they're sensory, and if they go down, they're motor. So if the name of a tract is called the spinocerebellar tract, it means it's going up the spine to the cerebellum, which is in the brain. So if it's going from the spine to the cerebellum, it's going up, it's a sensory tract. But if we call one tract let's call it the cortico-spinal tract. Cortico means cortex, which is the outer part of the brain. The cortex is the bark. That's the outer part. So if it's corticospinal, it's going from the brain down. That's a motor tract. So that's how you can kind of determine if a tract has sensory function or motor function, is by the name. It tells you the direction the signals are traveling. Okay. I'll give you another one. Spinothalamic tract. Spinothalamic. The thalamus is in the brain. Sensory tract. Okay. But what's interesting is that in the spinal cord, the white matter is on the outside, gray matter is on the inside. Look what happens in the brain. It's the opposite. The gray matter is on the outside. White matter is on the inside. It does a flip-flop. All right, let's take a look at this picture here. This is the vertebra, so you know this is the vertebral body. This is the transverse process. This is the spinous process, and these are muscles. And the spinal canal, where the spinal cord is here. So we're looking at the spinal cord, and these are nerves coming out. Your discs, your intervertebral discs, would sit on the vertebral bodies. And that's why when you have a herniated disc and that disc pushes out, it hits a nerve, maybe going down the right arm or right leg. Zings, right? Radiculopathies. When it herniates back this way, this is what happens, and it stays like this for a while. You see people walking with an anterior antalgic gait where they bend forward. You ever see the older gentleman that walks with a cane and they're bent forward? That's typically seen with spinal stenosis. Let's see if I can get this working better. Spinal stenosis. Stenosis just means narrowing. So whether the disc is pushing back, compressing the cord, or someone has ligaments back here and the ligaments are inflamed, narrowing the space, they create the same symptom where the person has this anterior antalgic gait where they're leaning forward and they can only walk like a block at a time. So anyway, the highlighted structure in orange, that's gray matter, not myelinated. In this picture, everything on the outside is myelinated. Okay, when we come back, we'll get into the brain.